9 years of marriage can be completely destroyed in exactly 4 seconds. That is the precise amount of time it takes a woman to open the door of her own kitchen and find another woman wearing her silk robe, sitting on her bar stool and drinking from her favorite mug as if the entire world belonged to her. Victoria Rivers had been flying for 42 minutes from Chicago to Houston, deciding to cut her business trip short by 2 days because she desperately missed the quiet peace of her home. She missed the orderly silence of the massive River Oaks mansion, the towering magnolia trees she had planted herself during their first year of marriage, but the most painful truth to admit was that she did not actually miss Richard. She arrived in a taxi because Richard had entirely ignored her 3 text messages, leaving her to be greeted by George, the 60-year-old estate doorman, whose warm smile lasted exactly half a second before melting into a profound, suffocating shame. Victoria noticed the subtle pause, observing how the older man immediately averted his gaze to the Italian marble floor of the grand foyer, his usually steady hands nervously gripping the hem of his uniform jacket. She smiled with her usual practiced grace, asking if her husband was home, and politely accepted George's stuttered confirmation without pressing for the agonizing details she was not ready to hear. For 9 long years, Victoria had cultivated the painful skill of not asking questions to which she did not want the answers, learning to exist merely as a decorative extension of a man who looked right through her. She carried her small carry-on bag up the sweeping golden-railed staircase that Richard had imported from Europe 3 years ago, a structural centerpiece she had always found incredibly beautiful but desperately cold. The main floor of the sprawling mansion was wrapped in a heavy silence. The hallway sconces dimmed to their usual evening intensity, illuminating the abstract blue painting Victoria had personally selected from an art gallery in Dallas. Everything was exactly in its proper place, perfectly pristine and untouched, except for a lingering, unfamiliar scent hanging heavily in the conditioned air. Victoria paused in the center of the corridor, closing her eyes and inhaling slowly, as if trying to identify a discordant musical note, instantly recognizing the heavy, overly sweet musk of an expensive but entirely classless perfume. She pushed open the heavy oak door to the kitchen because she had been traveling for hours and desperately needed a glass of water, refusing to allow a phantom scent to intimidate her in her own meticulously curated home. Ivy Fontaine was 28 years old, with dark hair cascading loosely over her shoulders, casually lounging at the black granite island, while wrapped in the very champagne-colored silk robe Richard had gifted Victoria for their 7th anniversary. The 2 women locked eyes in the harsh overhead light, and while Ivy's gaze flickered with a brief panicked flash of genuine terror, she quickly masked it with the thoroughly rehearsed expression of someone who had practiced this exact confrontation in the mirror. The digital clock on the stainless steel double oven softly glowed 10:43 in the evening, the massive refrigerator humming its constant, low drone while somewhere on the 3rd floor, Richard remained blissfully ignorant of the catastrophic collapse of his carefully managed double life. Victoria did not scream, did not throw the glass she had just picked up, nor did she demand a single frantic explanation from the younger woman sitting entirely frozen on the expensive leather bar stool. She merely looked at the precise knot tied at the waist of the silk robe, a highly specific, intricate loop that Richard tied every single morning when he helped Victoria into it, and experienced a moment of absolute, blinding clarity where every shadow of doubt instantly evaporated. With a single, decisive nod resembling a judge accepting an irrefutable piece of evidence, Victoria turned around in complete silence, walked out of the kitchen, and smoothly ascended the stairs toward the master suite to do exactly what she knew had to be done. Inside the cavernous, custom-built master closet that spanned the length of a small apartment, Victoria pulled down her large black suitcase with the silent wheels, the one she had purchased in Milan 4 years ago, and systematically began folding her clothes. Her hands trembled slightly, a subtle betrayal of her otherwise ironclad composure, but she folded 2 evening gowns, 3 blouses, her cherished music composition notebooks, a framed photograph of her mother, and the worn gold bracelet her grandmother had left her. She paused for a fraction of a second over her velvet jewelry drawer, looking down at the flawless platinum diamond ring Richard had bought her by casually telling her that price did not matter, before decisively leaving it nestled perfectly in its expensive velvet slot. Richard Rivers had been sitting in his third-floor executive study for 40 minutes, concluding a high-stakes video conference with his Dallas investors, when he suddenly heard the rhythmic, unmistakable sound of Victoria's calm footsteps echoing down the second-floor corridor. Knowing she was not scheduled to return until Thursday, he hastily terminated his call with a weak excuse, rushing out of his office only to collide with a panicked Ivy on the stairs, whose face was completely drained of its usual arrogant color. Hearing Ivy whisper that his wife had returned early, Richard froze for 3 agonizing seconds, his brilliant corporate mind desperately calculating the unfathomable magnitude of his personal disaster before he sprinted up the remaining stairs toward the master suite. He found Victoria standing with her back to the door, meticulously placing her shoes into the side compartment of her black luggage, her posture radiating an eerie, impenetrable tranquility that terrified him far more than any screaming match ever could. Richard stepped into the closet, his voice dropping into its authoritative boardroom register as he desperately begged her to stop, swearing that whatever she saw downstairs was a terrible mistake that he could entirely explain. Victoria finally turned to face him, her eyes completely devoid of anger, sorrow, or reproach, revealing only the terrifying, hollow absence of a woman who had already permanently departed, softly stating that she was not going anywhere, she was simply going home. Richard spent the first 20 minutes after Victoria's departure standing completely paralyzed in the grand foyer of his 80,000-square-foot mansion, staring blankly at the heavy mahogany door as if hoping the sheer force of his wealth could magically reverse time. George had discreetly vanished into the staff quarters, exhibiting the profound loyalty of an employee who recognizes that his employer's shattered dignity requires absolute isolation to properly bleed out in the shadows. When Ivy finally descended the stairs 25 minutes later, fully dressed and radiating an aggressive, calculated sympathy, Richard looked at her and felt an overwhelming wave of absolute disgust, immediately ordering her to leave his property without a single backward glance. The deafening silence of the massive house pressed against his chest as he furiously scrolled through his phone, staring at the 3 unread messages from Victoria that he had casually ignored earlier because he always believed her needs could wait. He called her number twice, listening to the agonizingly endless ringing before it finally clicked into her generic voicemail, leaving him feeling like an awkward, desperate teenager rather than a man who controlled a $4 billion construction empire. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Richard finally walked back up to the master bedroom, slowly sliding open her velvet jewelry drawer, only to find every single piece of expensive jewelry he had ever bought her lying abandoned, silently mocking the tragic inadequacy of his wealth. Desperation drove Richard out of his house at 7 o'clock the next morning, standing outside a modest apartment building in Montrose with a blue velvet box in his pocket and exactly 90 minutes of terrible sleep behind his bloodshot eyes. Lucy, Victoria's fiercest friend since they were 16 years old, opened the door with a hardened glare that completely neutralized Richard's imposing physical presence, staring at the billionaire with absolute, unfiltered contempt. When Richard pleaded that he desperately needed to speak with his wife because it was important, Lucy calmly informed him that his priorities had always been entirely backward, softly shutting the heavy wooden door squarely in his exhausted face. Returning to his corporate headquarters by 10 o'clock in the morning, Richard unleashed his executive assistant and his personal banking manager to frantically trace any financial movements, credit cards, swipes, or flight reservations made under Victoria's name in the last 12 hours. The search yielded absolutely 0 results, proving that Victoria had deliberately chosen to leave no digital or financial footprint, fully aware that Richard only knew how to hunt for people by following the long, arrogant paper trail of his own limitless money. By 11 o'clock, Richard sat in his private boardroom with his meticulous family lawyer, Mr. Ford, desperately trying to define the legal parameters of a separation that had occurred without a single piece of formal paperwork being filed. Catherine Rivers, a fiercely elegant woman of 72 years who refused to use a walking cane despite her doctor's orders, stormed into her son's mansion at exactly 12 noon, with a presence that instantly commanded the absolute attention of every staff member. After forcing Richard to confess the miserable details of his months-long affair with his young secretary, Catherine looked at her 51-year-old son with a devastating blend of ancient disappointment and maternal pity. She coldly reminded him that money is the pathetic tool men use when they have absolutely no genuine soul left to offer, ordering him to scrub the house of his mistress's stench before marching upstairs to properly pack the personal items Victoria actually cared about. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Richard's phone vibrated with a single, painfully brief text message from Victoria, firmly instructing him to water the magnolia trees because nobody else in that massive, empty mausoleum cared enough to do it properly. He walked out into the humid Houston heat, spending 10 frustrating minutes hunting for the green garden hose behind the tool shed because it was not perfectly coiled the way Victoria meticulously arranged it every single week for the past 9 years. Standing entirely alone in his sprawling, perfectly manicured estate, spraying water onto the dark soil beneath the blooming magnolias, Richard finally felt the agonizing, physical crush of a pain that had absolutely nothing to do with wounded pride and everything to do with monumental loss. The subsequent 72 hours systematically dismantled the arrogant illusion that Richard's life could function normally without the quiet, invisible infrastructure of his wife's daily grace and profound kindness toward the household staff. Ivy had attempted to return on the second morning at 9 o'clock, strutting into the foyer with a small overnight bag and an infuriatingly confident smirk, only to be verbally eviscerated by Richard and permanently banished from the estate in under 3 minutes. Meanwhile, the 7 members of the household staff, from Arthur the cook to the meticulous cleaning women, executed their duties with a chilling, robotic courtesy, punishing Richard with a flawless, impenetrable politeness that silently screamed their absolute loyalty to the exiled Mrs. Rivers. By the end of the 3rd day, Richard retreated entirely into his 3rd-floor study, pouring himself a neat glass of expensive amber whiskey at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, while staring blankly at the financial spreadsheets that suddenly felt utterly meaningless. He read through his 14 frantic, unanswered text messages to his wife, his thumb hovering over the digital keyboard, before simply typing that the magnolia trees were doing well, sending the pathetic lifeline into the digital void. Sleeping in the guest bedroom because the master suite felt like an active crime scene, Richard listened to the nighttime groans and settling timber of his massive house, realizing the terrible truth that a home without love is simply a very expensive, incredibly lonely cage. There is a highly specific, dangerous variety of sadness that absolutely refuses to cry because the soul has already completed the grueling, exhausting mathematics of a final decision, and Victoria Rivers woke up on Wednesday morning radiating exactly that terrifying, beautiful calmness. Lying in the small guest bed of Lucy's apartment, she stared up at a faint crack in the white plaster ceiling and felt the sudden, shocking absence of the massive psychological weight she had carried for 9 suffocating years. The exhausting burden of smiling at the correct corporate dinners, of dressing to appease aggressive investors, and of existing purely to regulate the unpredictable moods of an absent billionaire had completely vanished, leaving behind a terrifying but intoxicating emptiness. Walking into Lucy's living room, Victoria found an old, slightly out-of-tune Yamaha upright piano buried beneath a tragic collection of neglected houseplants, unlit scented candles, and dusty silver picture frames that had not been moved in 8 years. After carefully clearing the clutter, she sat on the wooden bench and placed her trembling fingers onto the yellowed ivory keys, running through her childhood Hanon scales before slowly transitioning into the complex Chopin nocturne she had mastered at 22 years old. The notes initially arrived with a clumsy, heavy hesitation. But as the muscle memory violently awakened in her forearms, Lucy stepped out of the kitchen and stood absolutely frozen in the hallway, weeping silently at the beautiful resurrection of her best friend's buried soul. On Thursday morning, Victoria found the courage to dial the direct office number of Alice, the formidable director of the Houston Cultural Arts Center, where Victoria had passionately taught intermediate piano during the first 2 years of her marriage before Richard convinced her to quit. Alice answered on the second ring, her voice instantly warming, with the profound relief of a director who desperately needed talent, immediately offering Victoria 3 vacant teaching slots for intermediate students that had been sitting entirely empty since February. Victoria accepted the position without a single moment of hesitation, pulling her sensible, low-heeled shoes from her luggage and spending her entire weekend sitting at Lucy's small kitchen table, furiously preparing her lesson plans with a massive, joyful cup of black coffee. When Monday finally arrived, Victoria walked into the bustling arts center wearing a simple linen skirt, carrying her meticulously organized binders, and stepped into her first classroom with the supreme, undeniable confidence of a woman finally speaking her native language. She patiently evaluated a diverse group of nervous teenagers and hopeful senior citizens who had waited 60 years to learn an instrument, instantly mapping out their unique technical weaknesses and offering gentle, precise corrections that made them instantly trust her. Leaving the building that afternoon, Victoria felt a profound, burning sense of irreplaceable purpose expanding in her chest, realizing she had finally reclaimed the vital piece of her identity that no amount of construction money could ever buy, sell, or successfully replicate. The unexpected miracle occurred completely by accident on Friday afternoon, when Alice generously allowed Victoria to spend 30 minutes completely alone in the main rehearsal hall with the center's prized Steinway grand piano, seeking closure for a melody haunting her mind. Victoria closed her eyes and began playing a complex, devastatingly beautiful piece in B minor that she had started composing 12 years ago but abandoned when she married Richard, letting the soaring, urgent notes pour the entirety of her recent heartbreak directly into the cavernous room. Unbeknownst to her, Sophia, the center's 23-year-old administrative assistant, had slipped through the back door and stood completely mesmerized, pulling out her smartphone to secretly record 1 minute and 40 seconds of the breathtaking, emotionally explosive finale. Sophia uploaded the raw video to her social media accounts that same evening, adding a desperate caption begging the internet to help identify the mysterious woman who had just delivered the most astonishingly beautiful piano performance she had ever witnessed in her life. The algorithmic explosion was instantaneous and absolute. The video racked up 80,000 organic views by Saturday morning, crossing the massive threshold of 400,000 views by Sunday afternoon as strangers shared their profound emotional reactions in thousands of comments. When Victoria arrived for work on Monday morning, she found Alice standing near the reception desk, frantically waving her vibrating smartphone and staring at Victoria with a completely bewildered mix of institutional pride and sheer, unadulterated shock. The massive momentum peaked on Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning when the main office phone rang, connecting Alice directly to Edward, a 54-year-old legendary music producer with 4 Grammy Awards and a brutal reputation for transforming obscure talent into global phenomenons. Alice practically sprinted down the hallway to interrupt Victoria's senior citizen piano class, passing a folded sticky note to her newly viral instructor, who calmly finished correcting her elderly student's posture before stepping out into the brightly lit corridor. The subsequent phone call between the billionaire's estranged wife and the legendary music producer lasted exactly 27 minutes, during which Victoria spoke with the chilling, absolute precision of a woman who completely understood her own immense value. When Edward boldly asked why a musician of her staggering caliber had abandoned the piano for an entire decade, Victoria stared out the window at the cracked asphalt of the center's modest parking lot, smiling a fiercely independent smile. She softly replied that life had temporarily dragged her in the wrong direction. But moving forward, she was the only person authorized to hold the compass, politely telling the eager producer she needed time to deeply consider his massive recording contract. Hanging up the phone, Victoria leaned against the cool plaster wall of the hallway, feeling the undeniable, glorious truth that she no longer needed a black suitcase to escape her past, because she had just effortlessly constructed an entirely new world with her own two hands. The intricate architecture of a massive lie can survive for months under the sheer force of arrogant confidence. But when a single, foundational brick crumbles, the entire structure collapses inward with the catastrophic, deafening roar of absolute ruin. Ivy Fontaine's carefully constructed double life suffered its first fatal fracture on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Victoria walked out, when Ivy sat nervously in the sterile, brightly lit examination room of Dr. Miller's private medical clinic. The 60-year-old physician, a man who famously despised delivering complex news with unnecessary emotional padding, handed Ivy a crisp white paper containing lab results that instantly vaporized her leverage, leaving her standing on the sweltering Houston sidewalk, feeling entirely trapped. The disastrous complication Ivy had desperately hidden from Richard for over 6 months involved Gregory, a ruthlessly ambitious 42-year-old executive who held a critical 20% minority stake in the sprawling Altamirano construction empire. Ivy's clandestine affair with Gregory had ignited 18 months ago during a drunken corporate retreat, evolving into a volatile, intensely physical entanglement that ran entirely parallel to her calculated, emotionally manipulative seduction of her incredibly wealthy boss, Richard. Staring blindly at the passing traffic, Ivy realized her dangerous mathematical problem had become fundamentally unsolvable. If Gregory discovered her medical reality before she secured a permanent, legally binding position in Richard's destroyed household, she would lose absolutely everything. Meanwhile, Richard's younger brother, Robert, a 38-year-old independent architectural consultant with deep, invisible connections throughout the Texas construction industry, had spent 2 agonizing weeks tracking a series of vicious corporate rumors surrounding Gregory's recent erratic behavior. Robert's most trusted industry informant had provided verifiable proof that Gregory had conducted 3 highly secretive meetings in obscure suburban hotels with executives from the Meridian Group, a fiercely aggressive Chicago conglomerate desperate to break into the lucrative southern construction market. Even more devastating, the informant casually mentioned that the Meridian executives possessed incredibly detailed private knowledge regarding Richard's collapsing marriage, celebrating the domestic chaos as a brilliant, perfectly timed distraction that would severely cripple Richard's executive focus. Robert spent 40 minutes sitting in his dark office, connecting the terrifying dots between Ivy's unprecedented access to Richard's private file and her incredibly convenient, simultaneous presence in his brother's bed during the exact months the corporate leaks occurred. He aggressively interrogated his corporate law contact with 3 highly specific questions regarding shareholder espionage, compiling the damning evidence into a single razor-thin manila folder before driving furiously toward the massive glass tower that housed Richard's executive headquarters. Interrupting his brother's critical engineering meeting, Robert pulled Richard into the soundproof glass corridor, his voice unnervingly flat, as he demanded a private, completely secure conversation regarding a betrayal that extended far beyond a simple ruined marriage. Sitting in the massive executive suite, Richard read the 3 documents Robert had compiled in absolute, suffocating silence, the color aggressively draining from his face as the sheer staggering magnitude of his own incredible stupidity finally materialized on paper. Robert watched his older brother carefully, refusing to offer a single shred of comforting sympathy, brutally pointing out that Victoria was not merely the tragic collateral damage of Richard's pathetic infidelity, but rather a specifically targeted victim in a calculated corporate assassination. Staring out at the sprawling Houston skyline he had spent 25 years dominating, Richard felt the devastating, physical nausea of a man who suddenly realizes he traded the most extraordinary woman he ever met for a cheap corporate spy. That same evening, as the walls began closing in on her hopelessly tangled lies, Ivy sent Richard a highly emotional, desperately urgent text message demanding they meet immediately to discuss a completely unexpected, life-altering development regarding their future. Richard sat at his heavy mahogany desk, staring at his glowing smartphone screen, while the crippling weight of Robert's investigative folder rested under his left hand, feeling an icy, absolute detachment replace the fiery chaos that had consumed him for weeks. He typed a terrifyingly brief response, coldly informing Ivy that any future communication between them would occur strictly within the secure walls of his corporate headquarters, explicitly moderated and legally documented by his fiercely aggressive family attorney, Mr. Ford. The legal machinery of Richard's $4 billion empire sprang into lethal, blindingly fast action over the weekend, utilizing an army of forensic accountants and digital security experts to successfully isolate the specific internal budgets Ivy had forwarded to Gregory's private email servers. Mr. Ford, a man whose hourly billing rate could easily purchase a luxury sports car, sat in Richard's private boardroom on Monday morning, systematically outlining a $43 million civil lawsuit designed to completely annihilate Gregory's financial existence and trigger the hostile buyout clause. Richard authorized the absolute destruction of his former partner with a single exhausted nod, realizing that winning a massive corporate war felt utterly hollow when he had to return every night to an 80,000-square-foot mansion that smelled entirely of his own monumental failures. The massive legal hammer finally dropped at exactly 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning when a licensed process server handed Gregory a devastating stack of formal legal notifications right in the middle of a crowded, high-end downtown coffee shop. Gregory immediately panicked, furiously dialing Ivy's private number and viciously threatening to expose her entire, disgusting role in the corporate espionage if she did not immediately help him neutralize Richard's aggressive legal assault. Sitting alone on her cheap apartment sofa, clutching her complicated medical results and listening to Gregory's screaming threats echo through the digital speaker, Ivy Fontaine finally understood the terrifying reality that she was completely, permanently out of moves. Under normal, predictable circumstances, an intermediate piano recital held on a Saturday evening does not manage to completely sell out a historic theater, boasting 400 velvet seats with an entire 3 weeks of advance notice. However, Victoria Rivers had rapidly evolved into a breathtaking local phenomenon, propelled by a viral video, 2 highly praised morning radio interviews, and a massive feature column in the Houston Chronicle declaring her the most brilliant hidden musical genius in the state of Texas. Alice, possessing the sharp logistical instincts of a seasoned arts director, had ruthlessly secured the historic Independence Theater in downtown Houston, asking Victoria if she was ready to face a massive public audience for the very first time in over a decade. Richard discovered the overwhelming magnitude of his wife's newly explosive career through a deeply humiliating channel. George, the loyal estate doorman, who proudly shoved his smartphone in Richard's face as the billionaire walked toward his waiting armored SUV. Staring at the digital promotional flyer featuring Victoria bathed in glorious golden sunlight at the Steinway piano, Richard politely thanked his employee, retreated into the plush leather back seat of his vehicle, and aggressively ordered his driver to head straight to the corporate office. Sitting alone in his massive suite, Richard obsessively refreshed the ticketing website, reading hundreds of wildly enthusiastic comments from absolute strangers who celebrated the immense healing power of his wife's music, feeling the razor-sharp agony of everything he had blindly thrown away. On the night of the highly anticipated recital, Richard arrived at the elegant theater at 8:15 in the evening, abandoning his usual corporate entourage and quietly purchasing the absolute last available ticket located in the deeply shadowed 20th row. The grand century-old building buzzed with an electric, reverent anticipation, the heavy red velvet curtains glowing under the warm brass chandeliers, as Richard slipped unnoticed into his far corner seat possessing a limited view of the stage, but a perfect angle to hear everything. When Victoria finally emerged at exactly 8 o'clock, wearing a sweeping, incredibly simple deep blue dress, and absolutely none of the heavy, expensive diamond jewelry he had purchased for her, the massive crowd erupted into a genuinely thunderous, loving applause. For the next 90 minutes, Richard sat completely paralyzed in the velvet darkness, entirely incapable of identifying the complex technical structures of the classical pieces she played, but profoundly overwhelmed by the staggering, undeniable emotional truth bleeding from her fingertips. He remembered the countless times he had walked past his own study, half listening to her practice while screaming into his smartphone about profit margins, completely deaf to the unbelievable world-class genius that was sitting quietly in his own home. When Victoria closed the magnificent concert by playing the viral B minor composition she had written 12 years ago, Richard felt hot, unfamiliar tears welling in his eyes, completely shattered by the realization that her music was a beautiful, soaring language she had created purely to survive his neglect. The standing ovation lasted an uninterrupted 4 minutes, a roaring tidal wave of pure adulation that forced Victoria to return to the polished stage 3 separate times to graciously accept massive bouquets of incredibly vibrant flowers from weeping strangers in the front row. Richard waited patiently until the massive theater had almost completely emptied before quietly slipping into the narrow, wood-paneled side corridor leading to the artist's exit, standing silently in the dim, yellow light without any rehearsed speech or manipulative strategy. When Victoria finally walked out, laughing brightly with Alice and Sophia, she stopped abruptly as her eyes locked onto Richard's face. Her expression did not shatter or harden, it merely settled into a calm, impenetrable peace as she politely dismissed her friends to speak with him alone. Richard stepped forward, his voice completely stripped of its usual commanding arrogance, softly telling her that her performance was the most incredibly beautiful thing he had ever witnessed in his entire 51 years of life. Victoria thanked him with the steady, unnerving composure of a seasoned diplomat, her hands firmly holding her flowers, as Richard admitted he had come strictly to listen, abandoning all desperate hopes of aggressively convincing her to return to their shattered marriage. A profound, incredibly honest silence stretched between them in the empty hallway before Victoria softly replied that she was no longer his wife, but she had finally found her absolute freedom, turning gracefully on her heel and walking out into the warm Houston night without looking back. The following Tuesday morning, Victoria sat in a quiet corner booth of a small sunlit coffee shop in Decatur, her hands wrapped tightly around a massive mug of black coffee as she listened to Robert systematically dismantle the remaining illusions of her marriage. Robert spoke gently but relentlessly for 40 minutes, laying out the incredibly toxic truth about Ivy's corporate espionage, Gregory's massive betrayal, and the devastating reality that her heartbreak was meticulously orchestrated as a strategic distraction to weaken Richard's business. Victoria absorbed the catastrophic information without shedding a single tear, her chest tightening as she fully realized she had been utilized as a completely disposable pawn on a billionaire's chessboard by people who viewed her absolute devastation as a mere corporate advantage. Walking out into the blinding midday sun, Robert offered a quiet, fiercely sincere apology on behalf of a brother who had taken far too long to understand the immense value of the woman he had carelessly destroyed. Victoria thanked him for treating her like a highly intelligent adult, capable of surviving the absolute truth, acknowledging that the new corporate details made the betrayal significantly uglier, but it could never erase the beautiful, undeniable reality of her newfound independence. Returning to Lucy's apartment at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Victoria immediately sat down at the old Yamaha piano, channeling the horrific sting of the corporate betrayal directly into the heavy wooden keys, playing with a ferocious, indestructible hope that absolutely nobody could ever steal from her again. There is a terrifying, utterly silent moment in every catastrophic failure where a man finally hits the absolute bottom of his soul, realizing with sickening clarity that he can no longer blame ambitious mistresses, treacherous business partners, or demanding corporate schedules for his ruin. Richard reached this desolate, undeniable bottom on a quiet Sunday morning, sitting alone in his massive third-floor executive study, staring at a blank piece of expensive ivory stationery for 40 minutes while a silver fountain pen rested completely motionless in his trembling right hand. He had attempted to draft this crucial letter 12 separate times over the weekend, repeatedly discovering that his brilliant talent for composing aggressive legal arguments and persuasive corporate contracts was completely useless when attempting to translate the profound depth of a genuinely broken heart. When the heavy ink finally met the thick paper, Richard did not write a single pathetic word about Ivy's corporate betrayal, Gregory's impending financial destruction, or the massive $43 million lawsuit his ruthless lawyers were systematically preparing for trial. Instead, he wrote exclusively about the agonizingly obvious truth he had ignored for 9 years, confessing the countless times he had cowardly used his massive construction empire as a convenient, impenetrable shield to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of actually loving her properly. He wrote that his greatest sin was not the spectacularly stupid affair, but the thousands of quiet, devastating moments where he sat across from a truly extraordinary woman at a dinner table and stared blankly at his phone, starving her soul through the absolute cruelty of his consistent indifference. At exactly 5 o'clock that Sunday afternoon, Richard stood nervously in the poorly lit hallway outside Lucy's modest apartment in Montrose, his broad shoulders slumped in exhaustion, as he handed a sealed, heavy envelope to a fiercely defensive Victoria standing firmly in the doorway. He explicitly told her that the envelope contained no demands, no manipulative requests for a forced reconciliation, and absolutely no expectation of a reply, begging her only to accept the physical evidence that he had finally, painfully learned to see her clearly. Before gently turning away to walk down the narrow stairwell, Richard quietly promised that regardless of her final decision, he was permanently burying the arrogant, careless man he used to be, leaving Victoria standing in the doorway with an incredibly complex, entirely unreadable expression. Victoria sat alone in Lucy's quiet living room at 20 minutes past 10 in the evening, carefully breaking the wax seal of the envelope and catching the heavy, completely unadorned platinum wedding band as it slid smoothly onto her lap. She read the incredibly raw, 3-page confession twice without making a single sound, feeling the strangely powerful, deeply validating comfort of finally having her profound, invisible suffering explicitly acknowledged by the exact man who had inflicted it upon her. She did not cry, nor did she immediately rush to the telephone to offer a miraculous, cinematic forgiveness. Instead, she placed the heavy platinum ring on the wooden table, closed her eyes, and allowed the incredible weight of his honest surrender to peacefully settle into her bones. Victoria found the courage to make the hardest decision of her life during an ordinary piano lesson, inspired by the determination of her 71-year-old student, William. Realizing that true strength comes from facing challenges with new resolve, she called Richard and agreed to meet him. During a long, honest conversation at a modest restaurant, they openly confronted the failures of their 9-year marriage and abandoned every remaining illusion. Victoria clearly established her conditions for moving forward. Her music career would never again be compromised. Emotional neglect would not be tolerated, and she would never return to the River Oaks mansion that symbolized their painful past. 3 months later, the family reunited for a quiet Sunday dinner at Catherine Rivers' home. Victoria had become a highly successful recording artist, while Richard had transformed himself through humility, accountability, and consistent effort to earn back her trust. Their renewed relationship reflected the understanding that genuine love is not based on perfection, but on the willingness to rebuild after failure with honesty and perseverance. Forgiveness proved to be a gradual process rather than an instant miracle, requiring courage from both the person seeking redemption and the one choosing to offer grace. In the end, their story demonstrated that the strongest relationships are those that survive hardship by being rebuilt on truth, respect, and unwavering sincerity.